The night spent by Levin on the hayrick was not without its lesson. His way of farming became repugnant to him, and entirely lost its interest. Notwithstanding the excellent crops, never, or at least it seemed to him that never, had there been such failure and such unfriendly relations between him and the muzhiks as this year. And now the reasons for this failure and this animosity were perfectly clear to him. The pleasure which he found in work itself, the resulting acquaintance with the muzhiks, the envy which seized him when he saw them and their lives, the desire to lead such a life himself, which on that night had not been visionary, but real, now that he had thought over all the details necessary to carry out his desire, all this taken together had so changed his views in regard to the management of his estate that he could not take the same interest in it as before, and he could not help seeing how these very unpleasant relations with the laborers met him at every new undertaking. The herd of improved cows like Pava, all the fertilized lands plowed with European plows, 9 equal fields set round with young trees, the 90 desyatins covered with dressing well plowed in, the deep drills and other improvements, all was excellent as far as it concerned only himself, or himself and the people who were in sympathy with him. But now he clearly saw, and his work, his treatise on rural economy, in which the principal element was found to be the laborer, helped him to this conclusion, that his present way of carrying on his estate was only a cruel and wicked struggle between him and the laborers, in which on one side, on his side, was a constant effort to change everything to what he thought a better model, while on the other side was the natural order of things. In this struggle he saw that on his side there were effort and lofty purpose, and on the other no effort or purpose, and that the result was that the estate went from bad to worse. Beautiful tools were destroyed, beautiful cattle and lands ruined. The principal objection was the energy absolutely wasted in this matter, and he could not help thinking now, when his thought was laid bare, that the aim of his energies was itself unworthy. In reality, where lay this quarrel? He insisted on having every penny of his own, and he could not help insisting on it, because he was obliged to use his energies to the utmost, otherwise he would not have wherewithal to pay his laborers, and they insisted on working lazily and comfortably, in other words, as they had always done. It was for his interest that every laborer should do his very best, above all should strive not to break the winnowing machines, the horse rakes, the threshing machines, so that he might accomplish what he was doing. But the laborer wanted to do his work as easily as possible, with long breathing spaces, with plenty of time for resting, and, what was more, without being bothered to think. This year Levin had this experience at every step. He sent men to mow the clover fields, selecting the poorer portions to be done first, where the intermixture of grass and wormwood made the crop unfit for seed, and they mowed his best fields, those reserved for seed, justifying themselves by saying that they had done what the overseer ordered, and trying to console him with the assurance that it would make splendid fodder. But he knew that they did this because these fields were the easiest ones to mow. He sent out the haymaking machine, but the muzhiks broke it on the first few rows because the driver, sitting on the box seat, disliked having the arms of the machine waving over his head, and they tried to console him with it by saying, "Oh, it's all right, the women will do the work easy enough." The new plows were condemned as good for nothing, because the muzhik did not think to raise the blade on turning a corner, but wrenched it round through the soil, thus tearing up the land and straining the horses, and here again they urged Levin to have patience with them. The horses strayed into the wheat, for the reason that no one would act regularly as night watchman, the muzhiks, in spite of strict orders to the contrary, insisting on taking the duty in turns, and Vanka, who had been at work all day, fell asleep during his watch. When accused, he acknowledged his fault and only said, "Do what you please with me." 3 of the best calves were poisoned. They were allowed to get into the clover aftermath without giving them water. The result was that they were blown out and died. But the muzhiks would not believe that it was the clover that did the harm. They tried to console Levin by informing him that one of his neighbors had lost 112 head within 3 days in the same way. All these mishaps took place, not because any one wished ill either to Levin or to his estate. On the contrary, he knew that the Muziks loved him and called him a simple-minded gentleman, prosтой barin, which was the highest praise. But these mishaps happened simply because the Muziks liked to work merrily and carelessly, and his interests were not only strange and incomprehensible to them, but even fatally clashed with what they thought their own true interests. For a long time Levin had felt that there was something unsatisfactory in his methods. He saw that his canoe was leaking, but he could not find the leaks, and he did not search for them, perhaps on purpose to deceive himself. Nothing would be left to him if he should allow his illusions to perish. But now he could no longer deceive himself. Not only had his system of management become uninteresting, but it had begun actually to disgust him, and he felt he could no longer continue it. Besides all this, Kitty Shtcherbatsky was within 10 versts of him, and he wanted to see her, and could not. Darya Alexandrovna Oblonskaya, when he called on her, invited him to come with the express purpose of renewing his offer to her sister, who, as she pretended to think, now cared for him. Levin himself, after he caught the glimpse of Kitty Shtcherbatsky, felt that he had not ceased to love her, but he could not go to the Oblonskys, because he knew that she was there. The fact that he had offered himself, and she had refused him, put an insurmountable barrier between them. "I cannot ask her to be my wife simply because she cannot be the wife of the man she wanted," he said to himself. The thought of this made him cold and hostile toward her. "I have not the strength to go and talk with her without a sense of reproach, to look at her without angry feelings, and she would feel even more incensed against me, and justly so. And besides, how can I go there now, after what Darya Alexandrovna told me? How can I help showing that I know what she told me? That I go with magnanimity, to pardon her, to be reconciled to her. I, in her presence, play the role of a pardoning and honor-conferring lover to her. Why did Darya Alexandrovna tell me that? If I had met her accidentally, then perhaps everything might have been arranged of itself. But now it is impossible. Impossible." Darya Alexandrovna sent him a note asking the loan of a side-saddle for Kitty. "They tell me you have a saddle," she wrote. "I hope that you will bring it yourself." This was too much for him. How could a sensible woman of any delicacy so lower her sister? He wrote 10 notes and tore them all up, and then sent the saddle without any reply. To write that he would come was impossible, because he could not come. To write that he could not come because he was busy, or was going away somewhere, was still worse. So he sent the saddle without any reply, and, with the consciousness that he was doing something disgraceful, on the next day, leaving the now disagreeable charge of the estate to the overseer, he set off to a distant district where there were magnificent snipe marshes, to see his friend Shyavsky, who had lately invited him to fulfill an old project of making him a visit. The snipe marshes in the district of Surov had long been an attraction to Levin, but on account of his farm work he had kept postponing his visit there. Now he was glad to escape from the neighborhood of the Shtcherbatskys, and especially from his estate, and to go on a hunting expedition, for which all his tribulations was a sovereign remedy. In the district of Surov there were neither railways nor post roads, and Levin took his own horses and went in a tarantass or traveling carriage. When he was halfway, he stopped to get a meal at the house of a rich muzhik. The host, who was a bald, robust old man with a great red beard, growing gray on the cheeks, opened the gate, crowding up against the post to let the troika enter. Pointing the coachman to a place under the shed in his large, neat, and orderly new courtyard with charred sokas or wooden ploughs, the old man invited Levin to enter the room. A neatly clad young girl, with galoshes on her bare feet, stooping down, was washing up the floor in the new entry. When she saw Levin's dog, she was startled and screamed, but immediately laughed at her own terror when she found the dog would not bite. With her bare arm she pointed Levin to the living room, then, stooping down again, she hid her handsome face and continued her scrubbing. "Will you have the samovar?" she asked. "Yes, please." The living room was large, with a Dutch stove and a partition. Under the sacred images stood a table ornamented with colored designs, a bench, and 2 chairs. Near the doorway was a cupboard with dishes. The window shutters were closed. There were a few flies, and it was so neat that Levin took care that Laska, who had been flying over the road and was covered with splashes of mud, should not soil the floor, and bade her lie down in a corner near the door. After glancing into the living room, Levin went to the back of the house. A good-looking girl in galoshes, swinging her empty pails on the yoke, ran to get him water from the well. "Lively there!" gaily shouted the old man to her, and then he turned to Levin. "So, sir, are you going to see Nikolai Ivanovitch Sviazhsky? He often stops with us," he began to say in his garrulous style, as he leaned on the balustrade of the steps. But just as he was in the midst of telling about his acquaintance with Sviazhsky, again the gate creaked on its hinges, and the workmen came in from the fields with their harrows and wooden plows. The horses attached to them were fat and in good condition. The laborers evidently belonged to the family. 2 were young fellows and wore colored cotton shirts and caps. The other 2 were hired men and wore shabby shirts. One was an old man, the other middle-aged. The old peasant, starting down from the porch, went to the horses and began to unharness them. "Where have you been ploughing?" "In the potato fields. We've finished with one. You, Feodot, don't bring the gelding, but leave him at the trough. We'll harness another." "Say, Batyushka, shall I tell 'em to take out the ploughshares, or bring 'em?" asked a big-framed, healthy-looking lad, evidently the old peasant's son. "Put 'em in the drags," replied the old man, coiling up the reins and throwing them to the ground. "Put things in order, then we'll have dinner." The handsome girl in galoshes came back to the house with her brimming pails swinging from her shoulders. The other women appeared from different quarters, some young and comely, others old and ugly, with children and without children. The samovar began to sing on the stove. The workmen and the men of the household, having taken out their horses, came in to dinner. Levin, sending for his provisions from the tarantass, begged the old peasant to take tea with him. "Well, I have already drunk my tea," said the old peasant, evidently flattered by the invitation. "However, for company's sake." At tea Levin learned the whole history of the old man's domestic economy. 10 years before he had rented of a lady 120 desyatins, and the year before had bought them, and he had rented 300 more of a neighboring landowner. A small portion of this land, and that the poorest, he sublet, but 40 desyatins he himself worked with the help of his sons and 2 hired men. The old peasant complained that all was going bad, but Levin saw that he complained only for form's sake, and that his affairs were flourishing. If they had been bad he would not have bought land for 500 rubles, or married off his 3 sons and his nephew, or built twice after his izba was burned, and each time better. Notwithstanding the old peasant's complaints, it was evident that he felt pride in his prosperity, pride in his sons, in his nephew, his daughters, his horses, his cows, and especially in the fact that he owned all this domain. From his conversation with the old man, Levin learned that he believed in modern improvements. He planted many potatoes, and his potatoes, which Levin saw in the storehouse, he had already dug and brought in, while on Levin's estate they had only begun to dig them. He used the plug on the potato fields, as he called the plough which he got from the proprietor. He sowed wheat. The little detail that the old peasant sowed rye and fed his horses with it, especially struck Levin. How many times Levin, seeing this beautiful fodder going to waste on his own estate, had wished to harvest it, but he found it impossible to accomplish it. The muzhik used it, and could not find sufficient praise for it. "How do the women do it?" "Oh, they pile it up on one side, and then the cart comes for it." "But with us proprietors everything goes wrong with the hired men," said Levin, filling his teacup and offering it to him. "Thank you," replied the old man, taking the cup, but refusing the sugar, pointing to the lumps which lay in front of him. "How can you get along with hired men?" said he. "It is ruinous. Here's Sviazhsky, for example. We know what splendid land, but they don't get decent crops, all from lack of care." "Yes, but how do you do with your workmen?" "It's all among ourselves. We watch everything. Lazybones, off they go. We work with our own hands." "Batyushka, Finnegan wants you to give him the tar water," said the woman in galoshes, looking in through the door. "So it is, sir," said the old man rising, and, having crossed himself many times before the icons or sacred pictures, he once more thanked Levin and left the room. When Levin went into the dark izba to give orders to his coachman, he found all the men folks sitting down to dinner. The peasant women were on their feet helping. The healthy-looking young son, with his mouth full of kasha gruel, got off some joke, and all broke into loud guffaws. And more hilariously than the others laughed the woman in galoshes, who was pouring shea or cabbage soup into a cup. It might well be that jolly face of the woman in galoshes cooperated powerfully with the whole impression of orderliness which this peasant home produced on Levin, but the impression was so strong that Levin could never get rid of it, and all the way from the old man's to Sviatsky's, again and again he thought of what he had seen at the farmhouse as something deserving special attention. Sviatsky was prédivotitel, or marshal of the nobility in his district. He was 5 years older than Levin, and had been married some time. His sister-in-law was an intimate of his family, and to Levin she was a very attractive young lady, and Levin knew that Sviatsky and his wife would be very glad for him to marry her. He knew this infallibly, as marriageable young men usually know such things, and he knew also that though he dreamed of marriage, and was sure that this fascinating young lady would make a charming wife, he would sooner have been able to fly to heaven than to marry her, even if he had not been in love with Kitty Shtcherbatsky. And this knowledge poisoned his pleasure in his prospective visit. On receiving Sviatsky's letter, with his invitation to go hunting, Levin had immediately thought about this, but in spite of it, decided that such views in regard to him on the part of Sviatsky were entirely gratuitous, and he decided to accept the invitation. Moreover, he had in the depths of his soul a strong curiosity to see this girl once more, and experiment on the effect that she would produce on him. Sviatsky's domestic life was in the highest degree pleasant, and Sviatsky himself was the very best type of the proprietor devoted to the affairs of the province, and this fact always interested Levin. He was one of those men that always excited Levin's amazement, whose opinions, very logical, although never self-formed, take one direction, while their lives, perfectly defined and content in their course, take another, absolutely independent of each other and almost always in opposition. Sviatsky was a thoroughgoing liberal. He despised the nobility, charged the majority of the nobles with secretly, and from motives of cowardice, opposing emancipation, and he regarded Russia as a rotten country like Turkey, and its government so wretched that he did not permit himself seriously to criticize its acts. And yet he had accepted public office and attended faithfully to his duties. He never even went out without donning his official cap, with its red border and cockade. He declared that human existence was endurable only abroad, where he was going to live at the first opportunity, but at the same time he carried on in Russia a very complicated estate in the most perfect style, and was interested in all that was going on in Russia, and was fully up with the times. The Russian muzhik, in his eyes, stood between man and monkey, but, when the elections came, he gave his hand to the peasants by preference, and listened to them with the utmost attention. He believed neither in God nor in the devil, but he showed great concern in the questions concerning ameliorating the condition of the clergy and the diminution of the revenues, and moreover he labored with especial zeal to have his village church kept in repair. In regard to the complete emancipation of woman, and especially her right to work, he sided with the most extreme supporters of this doctrine, but he lived with his wife in such perfect harmony that though they had no children everyone admired them, and he took entire direction of the family affairs, so that his wife did nothing, and could do nothing, except in cooperation with him, in order to pass the time as agreeably as possible. If Levin had not been naturally disposed to see the best side of people, the analysis of Sviatsky's character would have caused him no trouble or question. He would have said to himself, "Fool," or "good for nothing," and that would have been the end of it. But he could not say "fool," durak, because Sviatsky was undoubtedly not only very clever, but also very cultivated and an extraordinarily simple-hearted man, entirely free from conceit. There was no subject which he did not know, but he displayed his knowledge only when it was needed. Still less could he say that he was a good-for-nothing, because Sviazhsky was unquestionably an honorable, excellent, sensible man, who was always doing his work cheerfully and alertly, and had apparently never intentionally done anything wrong or could do anything wrong. Levin tried to comprehend and could not understand him, and always looked at him and his life as a living enigma. He and Levin had been friends, and therefore Levin allowed himself to study Sviazhsky, and tried to trace his view of life to the very source. But this was always an idle task. Every time Levin made the effort to penetrate a little further into the hidden chambers of Sviazhsky's mind, he discovered that the man was somewhat confused. A sort of terror showed itself in his eyes, as if he feared that Levin was going to entrap him, and he would give him a good-natured and jolly rebuff. Now, after his disenchantment on the subject of farm management, Levin was especially glad to be at Sviazhsky's. To say nothing of the fact that he was always pleasantly impressed by the sight of these doves so contented with themselves and all they possessed, and their comfortable nest, he had a great longing, now that he was so dissatisfied with his own life, to discover the secret of his having such clear, decided, and cheerful views of life. Moreover, Levin knew that he should meet at Sviazhsky's the proprietors of the neighborhood, and he was especially desirous to talk with them, to hear about their experiences in farm management, about their crops, their way of hiring service, and the like, which, as Levin knew well, it was the fashion to regard as very trifling topics of conversation, but which seemed to him more important than anything else. Perhaps these things were not important during the days of serfdom, or in England. In both those cases conditions are definitely fixed. But with us at the present time, when everything has been overturned and the new order is only just begun, the question how to regulate these conditions is the only important one in Russia. Such was Levin's conviction. The hunting which Sviazhsky gave him was poorer than Levin had expected. The marshes were dry and the woodcock scarce. Levin walked all day and bagged only 3 birds. But in compensation he brought back with him as always from hunting a ravenous appetite, capital spirits, and the intellectual excitement which violent physical exercise always gave him. Even when he was out hunting, while, as it would seem, his thoughts were not busy about anything, he kept remembering the old man and his family, and the impression remained with him that there was some peculiar tie between himself and that family. In the evening, at the tea-table in the company of 2 proprietors who had come on some business with the marshal, the interesting conversation that he had looked forward to soon began. At the tea-table Levin sat next to the hostess, and had to keep up a conversation with her and her sister who sat opposite him. His hostess was a moon-faced lady of medium stature and light complexion, all radiant with smiles and dimples. Levin endeavored, through her, to unravel the enigma which her husband's character offered him, but he could not get full control of his thoughts, because opposite him sat the pretty sister-in-law, in a gown worn, as it seemed to him, for his especial benefit, with a square corsage cut rather low in front, giving a glimpse of a very white bosom. This décolleté gown, in spite of the fact that the bosom was very white, or perhaps from the reason that it was very white, stopped the free flow of his thought. He could not help imagining, though of course erroneously, that this display was made for his benefit, and yet he felt that he had no right to look at it, and he tried not to look at it, but he was conscious of being to blame for her wearing such a gown. It seemed to Levin that he was deceiving some one, that he ought to make some kind of an explanation, but that it was an utter impossibility to do it, and so he kept blushing and felt ill at ease, and his constraint communicated itself to the pretty young lady. But the hostess seemed not to notice it, and kept up a very lively conversation. "You say that my husband does not take an interest in Russian affairs?" she asked. "On the contrary, he was happy when he was abroad, but not so happy as he is here. Here he feels that he is in his sphere. He has so much to do, and he has the faculty of interesting himself in everything. Oh, you've not been to see our school, have you?" "Yes, I have. That little house covered with ivy." "Yes, it is Nastia's work," said she, glancing at her sister. "Do you yourself teach?" asked Levin, trying to look at Nastia's face, but feeling that, in spite of himself, he would see the low corsage. "Yes, I teach, and intend to keep on teaching. But we have an excellent schoolmistress, and we have gymnastics." "No, thank you. I will not take any more tea," said Levin. He felt he was committing a solecism, but he could not keep up the conversation, and he rose in confusion. "I am very much interested in what they are saying," he added, and went to the other end of the table, where the host was talking with the two landed proprietors. Sviazhsky was sitting with his side toward the table, twirling his cup around with one hand, and with the other stroking his long beard and lifting it up to his nose and dropping it again as if he were smelling it. His bright black eyes were fixed with a keen amusement on one of the proprietors, a man with a white moustache, who was complaining bitterly about the peasantry. Levin saw that Sviazhsky had an answer ready for the worthy gentleman's comical complaints, and could reduce his arguments to powder if his official position did not compel him to respect the proprietors. The proprietor with the white moustache was evidently a narrow-minded country gentleman, an inveterate opponent of the emancipation, and an old-style farmer. Levin could see the signs of it in his old-fashioned, shiny coat, in his keen, angry eyes, in his well-balanced Russian speech, in his authoritative, slow, and studied manner, and his imperious gestures with his large, handsome, sunburnt hands, on one of which for sole ornament was an old-fashioned wedding ring. "If only it weren't a pity to abandon what has been done, cost so much labor. It would be better to give up, sell out, go abroad, and hear La Belle Helene, like Nikolai Ivanovitch," the old proprietor was saying, while his intelligent face lighted up with a pleasant smile. "There now, but still you don't sell out," said Nikolai Ivanovitch Sviazhsky. "So you must be well off on the whole." "I am well off in one way, because I have a home of my own, with board and lodging. Besides, one always hopes that the peasantry will improve. But would you believe it? This drunkenness, this laziness, everything goes to destruction. No horses, no cows. They starve to death. But try to help them. Take them for farm hands. They manage to ruin you. Yes, even before a justice of the peace." "But you, too, can complain to the justice of the peace," said Sviazhsky. "What? I complain? Not for all the world. All such talk shows the complaints are idle. Here, at the mill, they took their handsel and went off. What did the justice of the peace do? Acquitted them. Your only chance is to go to the communal court, to the starshina. The starshina will have the man thrashed for you. He settles things in the old-fashioned way. If it were not for him, you had better sell out, fly to the ends of the world." The proprietor was evidently trying to tease Sviazhsky, but Sviazhsky not only did not lose his temper, but was much amused. "Well, we carry on our estates without these measures," said he, smiling. "I, and Levin, and he." He pointed to the other proprietor. "Yes, but ask Mikhail Petrovitch how his affairs are getting along. Is that a rational way?" demanded the proprietor, especially accenting the word rational. "My way is very simple," said Mikhail Petrovitch. "Thank the Lord. My whole business lies in seeing that the money is ready for the autumn taxes. The muzhiks come and say, 'Batyushka, help us, father.' Well, all these muzhiks are neighbors. I pity 'em. Well, I advance 'em the first third, only I say, 'Remember, children, I help you, and you must help me when I need you, sowing the oats, getting in the hay, harvesting.' Now I get along with them as with my own family. To be sure, there are some among them who haven't any conscience." Levin, who knew of old about these patriarchal traditions, exchanged glances with Sviazhsky, and interrupting Mikhail Petrovitch, he said, "How would you advise?" addressing the old proprietor with the gray moustache. "How do you think one's estate ought to be managed?" "Well, manage it just as Mikhail Petrovitch does. Either give half the land to the muzhiks, or go shares with them. That is possible. But, all the same, the wealth of the country is growing less and less. Places on my lands which in the old time of serfage, under good management, produced ninefold, now produce only threefold. Emancipation has ruined Russia." Sviazhsky looked at Levin with smiling eyes, and even made a scarcely noticeable gesture to express his disdain. But Levin did not find the old proprietor's words ridiculous. He understood them better than he understood Sviazhsky. Much that the old man said in his complaint, that Russia was ruined by the emancipation, seemed to him true. For him it was novel and unanswerable. The proprietor evidently expressed his honest thought, a thought which arose, not from any desire to show an idle wit, but from the conditions of his life, which had been spent in the country, where he could see the question practically from every side. "The fact is, please to acknowledge," continued the old proprietor, who evidently wished to show that he was not an enemy of civilization, "all progress is accomplished by force alone. Take the reforms of Peter, of Catherine, of Alexander. Take European history itself. Still more so for progress in agriculture. The potato, for instance. To introduce potatoes into Russia required force. We have not always plowed with iron plows. Perhaps they have been introduced into our domains, but it required force. Now, until recently, when we had control over our serfs, we proprietors could conduct our affairs with all sorts of improvements, drawing rooms and winnowing machines and dung carts, all sorts of tools, we could introduce because we had the power, and the muzhiks at first would oppose and then would imitate us. But now, by the abrogation of serfage, they have taken away our authority, and so our estates, now that everything is reduced to the same level, must necessarily sink back to the condition of primitive barbarism. This is my view of it." "Yes, but why? If that were rational, then you could keep on with your improvements by aid of hired labor," said Sviazhsky. "We have no power. How could I, allow me to ask?" This is the working force, the chief element in the problem before us," thought Levin. "With hired men." "Hired men will not work well, or work with good tools. Our laborers know how to do only one thing, to drink like pigs, and, when they are drunk, to ruin everything you entrust them with. They water your horses to death, destroy your best harnesses, take the tires off your wheels, and sell them to get drunk, and stick bolts into your winnowing machines so as to render them useless. Everything that is not done in their way is nauseous to them. And thus the affairs of our estates go from bad to worse. The lands are neglected and go to weeds, or else are abandoned to the muzhiks. Instead of producing millions of tchverts of wheat, you can raise only a few 100,000. The public wealth is diminishing. If they were going to free the serfs, they should have done it gradually." And he developed his own scheme of emancipation, whereby all these difficulties would have been avoided. This plan did not interest Levin, but when the gentleman had finished he returned to his first proposition, with the hope of inducing Sviazhsky to tell what he seriously thought about it. He said, addressing Sviazhsky, "It is very true that the level of our agriculture is growing lower and lower, and that in our present relations with the peasantry, it is impossible to carry on our estates rationally," he said. "I am not of that opinion," said Sviazhsky, seriously. "I only see that we are not up to the point of managing our estates, and that on the contrary, since serfage was abolished, agriculture has decayed. I argue that in those days it was very wretched and very low. We never had any machines, or good oxen, or decent supervision. We did not even know how to make up our accounts. Ask a proprietor. He could not tell you what a thing cost, or what it would bring him." "Italian bookkeeping," said the old proprietor, ironically. "Reckon all you please, and get things mixed as much as you please. There will be no profit in it." "Why get things mixed up? Your miserable flail, your Russian topchachek, will break all to pieces. My steam thresher will not break to pieces. Then your wretched nags, how are they? A puny breed that you can pull by the tails comes to nothing. But our Petcherons are vigorous horses. They are worth something. And so with everything. Our agriculture always needed to be helped forward." "Yes, but it would need some power, Nikolay Ivanovitch. Very well for you, but when one has one son at the university and several others at school, as I have, he can't afford to buy Percherons." "There are banks on purpose." "To have my last goods and chattels sold under the hammer, no thank you." "I don't agree that it is necessary or possible to lift the level of agriculture much higher," said Levin. I am much interested in this question, and I have the means, but I cannot do anything. As for banks, I don't know whom they profit. Up to the present time, whatever I have spent on my estate has resulted only in loss. Cattle, loss. Machines, loss." "That is true," said the old proprietor with the grey moustache, laughing with hearty satisfaction. "And I am not the only man," continued Levin. "I call to mind all those who have made experiments in the rational manner. All, with few exceptions, have come out of it with losses. Will you admit that your farming is profitable?" he asked, and at that instant he detected in Sviazhsky's face that transient expression of embarrassment which he noticed when he wanted to penetrate further into the inner chambers of Sviazhsky's mind. However, the question was not entirely fair play on Levin's part. His hostess had told him at tea that they had just had a German expert up from Moscow, who, for 500 rubles fee, agreed to put the bookkeeping of the estate in order, and he found that there had been a net loss of more than 3,000 rubles. She could not remember exactly how much, but the German accountant had calculated it to within 40 kopecks. The old proprietor smiled when he heard Levin's question about the profits of Sviazhsky's management. It was evident that he knew about the state of his neighbor's finances. "Maybe it is unprofitable," replied Sviazhsky. "This only proves that either I'm a poor manager, or I sink my capital to increase the revenue." "Oh, revenue!" cried Levin with horror. "Maybe there is such a thing as revenue in Europe, where the land is better for the labor spent on it. But with us, the more labor spent on it, the worse it is. That is because it exhausts it. So there is no revenue." "How, no revenue? It is a law." "Then we are no exceptions to the law. The word renta, revenue, has no clearness for us, and explains nothing, but rather confuses. No, tell me how the doctrine of revenue can be—" "Won't you come have some curds? Masha, send us some curds or some raspberries," said Sviazhsky to his wife. "Raspberries have lasted unusually late this year." And with his usual jovial disposition of soul, Sviazhsky got up and went out, evidently assuming that the discussion was ended, while for Levin it seemed that it had only just begun. Levin was now left with the old proprietor, and continued to talk with him, endeavoring to prove to him that all the trouble arose from the fact that we did not try to understand our laborers' habits and peculiarities. But the old proprietor, like all people accustomed to think alone and for himself, found it difficult to enter into the thought of another, and clung firmly to his own opinions. He declared that the Russian music was a pig and loved swinishness, and that it needed force or else a stick to drive him out of his swinishness. But we are such liberals that we have suddenly swapped off the 1,000-year-old stick for these lawyers and jails, where the good-for-nothing, stinking music gets fed on good soup and has his pure air by the cubic foot. "Why," asked Levin, wishing to get back to the question, "do you think that it is impossible to reach an equilibrium which will utilize the forces of the laborer and render them productive?" "That will never come about with the Russian people. There is no force," replied the proprietor. "Why, could not new conditions be found?" asked Sviazhsky, who had been eating his curds and smoking a cigarette, and now approached the two disputants. "All the needful forms are ready for use, and well learned. That relic of barbarism, the primitive commune where each member is responsible for all, is falling to pieces of its own weight. The right of holding serfs has been abolished. Now there remains only free labor, and its forms are at hand, the day laborer, the journeyman, the ordinary farmer. And you can't get rid of this." "But Europe is discontented with these forms." "Yes, and perhaps discontent will find new ones, and will progress probably." "This is all I say about that," said Levin. "Why should we not seek for them on our side?" "Because it would be much the same as our pretending to invent new methods of constructing railways. Our methods are all ready. All we have to do is to apply them." "But if they do not suit us? If they are hurtful?" Levin insisted. And again he saw the frightened look in Sviazhsky's eyes. "Well, this. We throw up our caps. We follow wherever Europe leads. All this I know. But tell me, are you acquainted with all that is going on in Europe about the organization of labor?" "No, I know very little." This question is now occupying the best minds in Europe. Schultz Delitz and his school, then all this prodigious literature on the labor question, the tendencies of Lassalle, the most radical of all of them, the Mühlhausen organization, this all is a fact, you surely must know." "I have an idea of it, but it's very vague." "No, you only say so. You know all this as well as I do. I don't set up to be a professor of social science, but these things interest me. And I assure you, if they interest you, you should go into them." "But where do they lead you?" "Beg pardon?" The two proprietors got up, and Sviazhsky, again arresting Levin in his disagreeable habit of looking into the inner chambers of his mind, went out to bid his guests good bye. Levin spent the evening with the ladies, and found it unendurably stupid. His mind was stirred, as never before, at the thought that the dissatisfaction he felt in the administration of his estate was not peculiar to himself, but was a general condition to which affairs in Russia had evolved, and that an organization of labor, whereby the work would be carried on in such a manner as he saw at the muzhiks on the highway, was not an illusion, but a problem to be solved. And it seemed to him that he could settle this problem, and that he must attempt to do it. Levin bade the ladies good night, promising to go with them the following morning for a ride to visit some interesting spots in the Crown Woods. Before going to bed, he went to the library to get some of the books on the labor question which Sviazhsky had recommended. Sviazhsky's library was an enormous room, lined with bookshelves, and having two tables, one a massive writing table standing in the center of the room, and the other a round one, laden with recent numbers of journals and reviews in different languages, arranged about a lamp. Near the writing table was a cabinet, stiolka, containing drawers inscribed with gilt lettering for the reception of various documents. Sviazhsky got the volumes and sat down in a rocking chair. "What is that you are looking at?" he asked of Levin, who was standing by the round table and turning the leaves of a review. Levin held up the review. "Oh, yes, that is a very interesting article indeed. It argues," he continued with gay animation, "that the principal culprit in the partition of Poland was not Frederick after all. It appears," and he gave with the clearness characteristic of him a digest of these new and important discoveries. Although Levin was now more interested in the question of farm management than in anything, he asked himself, as he listened to his friend, "What is he in reality? And why does the partition of Poland interest him?" When Sviazhsky had finished, Levin could not help saying, "Well, and what of it?" But he had nothing to say. It was interesting simply from the fact that it argued. But Sviazhsky did not explain, and did not think it necessary to explain, why it was interesting to him. "Well, but the irascible old proprietor interested me very much," said Levin, sighing. "He's sensible, and a good deal of what he says is true." "Ah, don't speak of it. He is a confirmed slaveholder at heart, like the rest of them." "With you at their head." "Yes, only I am trying to lead them in the other direction," replied Sviazhsky, laughing. "His argument struck me very forcibly," said Levin. "He is right when he says that our affairs, that is, the rational management, cannot succeed, that the only kind that can succeed is the money-lending system like that of the other proprietor, or, in other words, the one that is the simplest. Who is to blame for this?" "We ourselves, of course. But then it is not true that it does not succeed. It succeeds with Vassiltchikov." "The mill." "But still I don't know what surprises you about it. The peasantry stand on such a low plane of development, both materially and morally, that it is evident they'll oppose everything that is strange to them. In Europe the rational management succeeds because the people are civilized. In the first place, we must civilize our peasantry. That's the point." "But how will you civilize them?" "To civilize the people 3 things are necessary: schools, schools, and schools." "But you yourself say the peasantry stand on a low plane of material development. What good will schools do you in that respect?" "Do you know, you remind me of a story of the advice given to a sick man. You had better try a purgative. He tried it and grew worse. Apply leeches. He applied them and grew worse. Well, then, pray to God. He tried it, he grew worse. So it is with you. I say political economy, you say you're worse for it. I suggest socialism, Worse still. Education? Still worse." "Yes, but how can schools help?" "They will create other needs." "But this is the very thing I could never understand," replied Levin vehemently. "In what way will schools help the peasantry to better their material condition? You say that schools, education, will create new needs. So much the worse, because they will not have the ability to satisfy them, and I could never see how a knowledge of addition and subtraction and the catechism could help them to better themselves materially. Day before yesterday I met a peasant woman with a baby at the breast, and I asked her where she was going. She said she had been to the babka's. The child had a crying fit, and I took him to be cured. I asked, how did the babka cure the crying fit? She set him on a hen roost and muttered something. "Well there," cried Sviazhsky, laughing heartily. "You yourself confess it. In order to teach them that they can't cure children by setting them on hen roosts, you must—" "Ah no," interrupted Levin with some vexation. "Your remedy of schools for the people I only compared to the babka's method of curing. The peasantry are poor and uncivilized. This we see as plainly as the woman saw her child's distress because he was crying. But that schools can raise them from their wretchedness is as inconceivable as the hen roost cure for sick children. You must first remedy the cause of the poverty." "Well, in this at least you agree with Spencer, whom you do not like. He says that civilization can result from increased happiness and comfort in life, from frequent ablutions, but not by learning to read and cipher." "There now, I'm very glad, or rather very sorry if I am in accord with Spencer. But this I have felt for a long time. Schools cannot help. The only help can come from some economical organization, whereby the peasantry will be richer, will have more leisure. Then schools also will come." "Nevertheless, schools are obligatory now all over Europe." "But how would you harmonize this with Spencer's ideas?" asked Levin. But into Sviazhsky's eyes again came the troubled expression, and he said with a smile, "No, the story of the crying fit was capital. Is it possible that you heard it yourself?" Levin saw that there was no connection between this man's life and his thoughts. Evidently it was perfectly indifferent to him where his conclusions led him. Only the process of reasoning was what appealed to him, and it was disagreeable to him when this process of reasoning led him into some stupid, blind alley. This was what he did not like, and he avoided it by leading the conversation to some bright and agreeable topic. All the impressions of this day, including those which arose from his visit to the old muzhik, and which seemed somehow to give a new basis to his thoughts, troubled Levin profoundly. This genial Sviazhsky, who kept his thoughts for general use and evidently had entirely different principles for the conduct of his life, keeping them hidden from Levin, while at the same time he and the majority of men, the throng whose name is Legion, seemed to be ruled by the general consensus of opinions by means of ideas strange to him. The testy old proprietor, perfectly right in his judicious views of life, but wrong in despising one entire class in Russia, and that perhaps the best. His own discontent with his activity, and the confused hope of setting things right at last, all this excited and disturbed him. Levin retired to his room and lay down on his springy mattress, which unexpectedly exposed his arms and legs every time he moved. But it was long before he could get to sleep. His conversation with Sviazhsky, though many good things were said, did not interest him, but the old proprietor's arguments haunted him. He involuntarily remembered every word that he said, and his imagination supplied the answer. "Yes, I ought to have replied to him. You say that our management is not succeeding because the muzhik despises all improvements, and that force must be applied to them. But if our estates were not retrograding, even where these improvements are not found, you would be right. But advance is made only where the laborer works in conformity with his own customs, as at the old man's by the roadside. Our general dissatisfaction with our management proves that either we or the laborers are at fault. We have long been losing, both by our own methods and by European methods, by neglecting the qualities of the laboring force. Let us be willing to acknowledge that the laboring force is not ideal as a force, but is the Russian muzhik with his instincts, and we shall then be able to manage our estates in conformity with this," I should have said to him. "Imagine that you are carrying on an estate like that of my old man by the roadside. that you had found a way of interesting your laborers in the success of their work, and had found that by means of improvements, such as they would acknowledge to be improvements, you had succeeded in doubling or trebling your returns without exhausting the soil. Then suppose you make a division and give a half to your working force. The residue which you would have would be larger, and that which would come to the working force would be larger. But to do this there must be a coming down from anything like ideal management, and the laborers must be interested in the success of the management. How can it be done? This is a question of details, but there is no doubt that it is possible. This idea kept Levin in a state of agitation. Half the night he did not sleep, thinking of the details connected with carrying out his new plans and schemes. He had not intended to leave so soon, but now he decided to go home on the morrow. Moreover, the memory of the young lady with the open dress came over him with a strange sense of shame and disgust. But the main thing that decided him was his desire to lay before his muzhiks his new project before the autumn harvests, so that they might reap under the new conditions. He decided to reform his whole method of administration. The carrying out of Levin's plan offered many difficulties, but he persevered, and finally succeeded in persuading himself without self-deception that the enterprise was worth the labor, even though he should not succeed in doing all that he wanted to do. One of the principal obstacles which met him was the fact that his estate was already in running order, and that it was impossible to come to a sudden stop and begin anew, but that he had to remodel his machine while it was going. When he reached home in the evening, he summoned his overseer and explained to him his plans. The overseer received with undisguised satisfaction all the details of this scheme, as far as they showed that all that had been done hitherto was absurd and unproductive. The overseer declared that he had long ago told him so, but that no one would listen to him. But when it came to Levin's proposition to share the profits of the estate with the laborers, on the basis of an association, the overseer put on an expression of the deepest melancholy, and immediately began to speak of the necessity of bringing in the last sheaves of wheat, and commencing the second ploughing, and Levin felt that now was not a propitious time. On conversing with the muzhiks about his project of dividing with them the products of the earth, he found that here his chief difficulty lay in the fact that they were too much occupied with their daily tasks to comprehend the advantages and disadvantages of his enterprise. A simple-minded muzhik, Ivan the herdsman, seemed to comprehend and to approve Levin's proposal to share with him the profits of the cattle. But whenever Levin went on to speak of the advantages that would result, Ivan's face grew troubled, and, without waiting to hear Levin out, he would hurry off to attend to some work that could not be postponed, either to pitch the hay from the pens, or to draw water, or to clear away the manure. Another obstacle consisted in the inveterate distrust of the peasants, who would not believe that a proprietor could have any other aim than to get all he could out of them. They were firmly convinced, in spite of all he could say, that his real purpose was hidden. They, on their side, in expressing their opinions, had much to say, but they carefully guarded against telling what their actual object was. Levin came to the conclusion that the irate proprietor was right in saying that the peasants demanded, as the first and indispensable condition for any arrangement, that they should never be bound to any of the new agricultural methods, or to use the improved tools. They agreed that the new-fashioned plough worked better, that the weed extirpator was more successful, but they invented 1,000 reasons why they should not use them, and, although he had made up his mind that there must be a coming down from anything like ideal management, he felt deep regret to give up improvements the advantages of which were so evident. But in spite of all these difficulties, he persevered, and by autumn the new arrangement was in working order, or at least seemed to be. At first Levin intended to give up his whole domain just as it was to the muzhiks, the laborers, and overseer on the new conditions of association. But very soon he found that this was impracticable, and he made up his mind to divide the management of the estate. The cattle, the garden, the kitchen garden, the hay-fields, and some lands fenced off into several lots were to be reckoned as special and separate divisions. Ivan, the simple-minded herdsman, who seemed to Levin better fitted than anyone else, formed an artel, or association, composed of the members of his family, and took charge of the cattle yard. A distant field, which for 8 years had been lying fallow, was taken by the shrewd carpenter, Fyodor Ruzanov, who joined with him 7 families of muzhiks, and the muzhik-shuraev entered into the same arrangements for superintending the gardens. All the rest was left as it had been, but these 3 divisions constituted the beginning of the new arrangement, and they kept Levin very busy. It was true that matters were not carried on in the cattle yard any better than before, and that Ivan was obstinate in his opposition to giving the cows a warm shelter, and to butter made of sweet cream, asserting that cows kept in a cold place required less feed, and that butter made of sour cream was made quicker, and he demanded his wages as before, and he was not at all interested in the fact that the money that he received was not his wages, but his share of the profits of the association. It was true that Ruzanov and his associates did not give the fields a second ploughing, as they had been advised to do, and excused themselves on the ground that they had no time. It was true that the muzhiks of this company, although they had agreed to take this work under the new conditions, called this land, not common land, but shared land, and the muzhiks and Ruzanov himself said to Levin, "If you would take money for the land, it would be less bother for you, and that would let us out." Moreover, these muzhiks kept putting off under various pretexts the building of the cattle yard and barn, and did not get it done till winter, though they had agreed to build it immediately. It was true that Shuraev tried to exchange for a trifle with the muzhiks the products of the gardens which he had undertaken to manage. He evidently had a wrong notion, and a purposefully wrong notion, of the conditions under which he had taken the land. It was true that often in talking with the muzhiks and explaining to them all the advantages of the undertaking, Levin was conscious that all they heard was the sound of his voice, that they were firmly convinced that they were too shrewd to let him deceive them. He was especially conscious of this when talking with the cleverest of the muzhiks, Ruzanov. He noticed in the man's eye a gleam which betrayed evident scorn for Levin, and a firm conviction that if anyone was to be cheated it was not he, Ruzanov. But, in spite of all these drawbacks, Levin felt that he was making progress, and that if he rigorously kept his accounts and persevered he should be able to show his associates at the end of the year that the new order of things could bring excellent results. All this business, together with his work in connection with the rest of his estate, which still remained in his own hands, and together with his work in the library on his new book, so filled his time during the summer that he scarcely ever went out, even to hunt. Toward the end of August he learned through the man that had brought back the saddle that the Oblonskys had returned to Moscow. By not having replied to Darya Alexandrovna's letter, by his rudeness which he could not remember without a flush of shame, he felt that he had burnt his ships, and he never again could go to them. In exactly the same way he owed apologies to Sviazhsky for having left his house without bidding him good-bye. Neither would he again dare to go to Sviazhsky's. But now all this was a matter of indifference to him. He was more interested and absorbed in his new scheme of managing his estate than in anything that he had ever attempted. He finished the books which Sviazhsky had lent him, and others on political economy and socialism which he had sent for. In the books on political economy, in Mill, for example, which he studied first with eagerness, hoping every minute to find a solution of the questions which occupied him, he found laws deduced from the position of European husbandry, but he could not see how these laws could be profitably applied to Russian conditions. He found a similar lack in the books of the socialist writers. Either they were beautiful but impracticable fancies, such as he dreamed when he was a student, or modifications of that situation of things applicable to Europe, but offering no solution for the agrarian question in Russia. Political economy said that the laws by which the wealth of Europe was developed and would develop were universal and fixed. Socialistic teachings said that progress according to these laws would lead to destruction. But neither school gave him any answer or as much as a hint on the means of leading him and all the Russian muzhiks and agriculturalists, with their millions of hands and of destians, to more successful methods of reaching prosperity. As he was already involved in this enterprise, he conscientiously read through everything that bore on the subject and decided in autumn to go abroad and study the matter on the spot, so that he might not have with this question the experience that had so often met him with various questions in the past. How many times in a discussion he had just begun to understand his opponent's thought and to expound his own, when suddenly the question would be asked, But Kaufmann, Jones, Dubois, Mitchell, you have not read them? Read them. They have worked out this question." He saw clearly now that Kaufmann and Mitchell could not tell him anything. He knew what he wanted. He saw that Russia possessed an admirable soil and admirable workmen, and that in certain cases, as with the music by the roadside, the land and the laborers could produce abundantly, but that in the majority of cases when capital was spent upon them in the European manner, they produced little, and that this resulted entirely from the fact that the laborers liked to work, and work well only in their own way, and that this contrast was not the result of chance, but was permanent and based on the very nature of the people. He thought that the Russian people, which was destined to colonize and cultivate immense unoccupied spaces, would consciously, until all these lands were occupied, hold to these methods as necessary to them, and that these methods were not so bad as they were generally considered. And he wanted to demonstrate this theoretically in his book, and practically on his estate.